I'm so glad that everyone can come to this Code Labs Career Talk. I'm super happy that we can have Tommy today giving his talk about why you should make things. Thank you.
Awesome. I appreciate it. And thank you so much for having me, everyone. I'm excited to get to talk to you all about how I think about career development. And I'll give you but I'm not really going to talk a ton about that. Instead, I'm going to talk about how I think about the alternative paths for defining how people will judge your career, and therefore how you get more control over your career and everything surrounding it. A little bit of background on me that probably is provided, but I'm the CEO of a company called alloy.co. We basically protect people's identities on the internet when they're applying for financial accounts specifically. So we're the folks who help try to make sure good people or people who are who they say they are and haven't stolen other people's identities can get like credit cards and checking accounts in their own name, but can't get them in somebody else's name. So we kind of do that behind the scenes. We're a near 50-person company, have raised a lot of venture capital, have a lot of tier 1 clients we're super excited about and are growing quickly. But I'm not mostly going to talk about my career today and my trajectory, although everything I'm going to talk about I've experienced, I think, firsthand. I'm going to kind of talk about some other things and how making stuff as a broad concept can help move the needle for you. So I'm going to share my screen here. And hopefully everyone can see something that says you should make things. I'm sure Cora will tell me if you can't.
Yep, I can see it.
All right. All right, so it's my core belief, and this is like a super basic statement, I know, and it almost seems like it must inherently be so obvious that it can't have any value, but I think one of the most important ways to think about how to move from kind of deciding how to move through a career or something resembling a career if you decide to kind of do stuff on the side. I think the core thing you should always keep in mind is that you have a couple of options, and one of them that can really be transformative is to turn yourself into somebody who makes things. And so I want to talk about why I believe that's so powerful. The first reason, and actually the whole fundamental premise behind this, is that I believe that people are unfortunately constantly being measured, and that, like it or not, this impacts your life in a lot of ways that are a little bit unpleasant, because being measured isn't fun. Nobody likes it when nobody likes to be judged in the first place. That's why people are constantly talking about, are you judging me? This is a no judgment zone. But unfortunately, folks like your parents, parents, teachers, friends, even to a large extent, and especially peers and potential employers, are always trying to come up with heuristics for whether you're on the right path or the wrong path. So it's not fun and it isn't optional. And so we have to deal, I remember when I was especially in college and I was realizing I was going to have to deal with this reality. Like I wasn't going to be able to sort of define, I didn't see a way to define my own success. I only saw the way that other people were defining my success. And I really wanted a way out of this. And I think the good news is that you can actually make a choice. It's not an easy choice, but you can make a choice about how to be measured. And this can be a conscious choice. This choice comes down to what you decide to do and what you decide to sort of portray about yourself and your career. And option number one is the option that you will be, that folks will talk to you about the most. And it's probably something, and I want to make it clear that this option is a valid option and it actually has a ton of power behind it. But it's just the option that you already know, which is to be measured on other people's criteria, which is going to come down to credentials. What I'm talking about in a career path sense is, getting a credential like a degree from Stanford or Harvard Business School, going to work at, God forbid, Goldman Sachs or McKinsey, going to work at Google or Facebook. These are credentials you can carry with you that tell people, hey, if you're wondering if I'm, on the right track or making progress or sort of worth spending resources on, you can just look at my credential. I worked at Google, I worked at McKinsey, I went to Stanford, I went to Harvard Business School. And this is a totally valid path. This is incredibly powerful to get these credentials, and you should use this as a tool. You should be aware that these credentials, as much as people want to go around saying, that they don't matter or that they look at people outside of these credentials, they are super powerful, and I don't want to dismiss that. But at the same time, these as the only option for getting people to understand who you are, what your worth is really a distasteful prospect. It is no fun to live in a world where you have to go work at Goldman Sachs, and some of you may have or may work at Goldman Sachs in the future, so I don't want to pick on it too much, but for that to be the only option to get a credential that tells people that you are worth investing in, worth spending time with, are valuable, and your insights are valuable, is just so distasteful that that I just, when I was facing this sort of reality, I just thought, like, I'm gonna have to find another way. And luckily there's really good news, and I actually think this second option is becoming more and more the norm as we move toward a world where folks can share what they do and what they work on outside of credentialed walls. And I actually think this is the option that, if it doesn't sound like, or you don't feel like you're somebody who has walked the exact path that can get you into, Goldman Sachs, Stanford, Harvard, or whatever, which that's the vast majority of people have not walked the exact path that's going to take you to these credentials. Some of the smartest people, most of the smartest people, most of them, and basically, most people just in general, by definition, haven't walked the exact path that's going to convince Stanford University that you should go there, or McKinsey that you should have a job there, and yet are super, super valuable, important people, as we all are. So option number 2 is to design your own criteria. And this is harder because there's a playbook for getting into Stanford. It's a really hard to achieve playbook, but it exists. There is a playbook, get perfect grades, do really well on your SATs, do extracurriculars, and then apply there, and then figure out how to pay for that. So there's a lot of ifs there, but you can do it. And there's a playbook. By designing your own criteria, though, you are going to shift the narrative entirely by making things. People are not very good at knowing what to make of people who create things from scratch. Folks who go through a process of trying to get into Stanford or get a job at Facebook or get a job at Goldman Sachs, people know kind of like what it takes to get there, and whether you achieve it or not. So you have like this end game. Either you did get in or you didn't get in. And people really know how to kind of judge whether you're on the path to that. So if you say, that's my goal, then folks really know how to say whether you're on track, whether you made it, whether you've been there, or whether you haven't. But when you create things from scratch and when you build things from the ground up, there's so few people that really go through that process of being truly sort of a creator of a thing, whether it's a movement, whether it's a product, whether it's a nonprofit organization, whether it's a series of events, whether it's a blog, it doesn't matter what it is. Very few people go through the process of actually creating something that has any impact at all. And so it's very, very difficult for folks to judge whether you're being successful at that. Not to mention that if you are successful at it, you get to be successful under criteria that you control, and that actually is more impressive than any of the credentials that you can achieve elsewhere. This is how I think this basically plays out. You make things and you create them, you put them out into the wild, and people become aware that you are a maker of things. That causes people to have to think about you entirely differently. They know if you're creating things from scratch, that by definition, you're not playing in the sandbox that was put in front of you, you're building your own. And so now everybody has to change their internal narrative about you, which is going to lead to a ton of personal growth in every single way. I'll give you an example that I love to point out, which is one of my best friends in the world. Actually, all these folks are friends of mine, and they all actually are good examples of this story. But my friend Matt Russo, I think, is a great example, and he's the gentleman on the right. So this is the website of the college that Matt went to, Virginia Commonwealth in Richmond, Virginia. And as of for several months, a few years ago, the homepage was basically a picture of Matt and his co-founders of his startup. And I just want to point out that VCU was trying to sell students on coming to VCU, and this is who they decided to put on the front of the website. Did not bother to shave before getting photographed to be on the homepage of the website of his alumni association of the school where he went to college, of his alma mater. You know, not somebody you're traditionally expecting to be the front of a college's website, handsome though he may be. And it also, this is where I really got excited about this homepage, which is that it says 3 former VCU students, you know, are building a startup and they got money for it, et cetera, et cetera. But it says 3 former VCU students. And I just want to point out that Matt is only technically a former VCU student. He dropped out of VCU after 1 or 2 semesters to pursue a career where he was going to create his own things. And yet, if we kind of go back here, VCU is pretty interested in making sure that you know that he's a former VCU student. So we've got the vcu.edu website. We've got Matt Russo on the front of it, touted as a former VCU student because they believe that his creative career building startups from scratch was such a powerful message to send about what you could be if you went to VCU that they needed to highlight it on their homepage. I want to point out that this gentleman over here, Ace Callwood, on the left, they actually recruited him shortly after he graduated. And I hope he won't be offended by me saying without having super stellar, you know, top level grades or anything like that. They actually recruited him to be a professor at the school when he was like 24 years old because of the career that he had working with Matt and Justin on a bunch of things, including the startup that's referenced here. Because it was so powerful to the university, which is one of those institutions, is a credentialing institution. It was so powerful to them that folks who were associated with them had gone off and created things from scratch, that even though one of them had not even graduated from the school and another one of them, you know, was maybe not the best student in the world, they wanted to not only highlight them, but bring them back into the fold as potentially teachers of other people. That's how powerful this idea of creating things is and how much it changes the narrative from being judged by credentials, which are going to be like grades and degrees, to the folks that have to give you those credentials actually deciding that those credentials no longer matter and what you've actually done is what matters. And I can promise you that if Matt can change his narrative by making things, so can you. I keep making things very broad because I don't want to pitch you on starting a startup or writing a blog or starting a newsletter or any particular thing. I really have seen that this concept can be applied very, very broadly. And I think you should think about your career in the same way by taking a very broad stroke, thinking about this in a very broad way. You should be making things from scratch and sharing them with the world, but those can be everything from actual like movements to thoughts to products to businesses to nonprofits. It can take a lot of forms. What's important about it is that you own what it is that you're working on and you own what the success criteria of that are. So my suggestion is you should make stuff, you should share it with people. It will inspire and confuse people and change the way they think about you because they no longer have a linear way to judge you. And I believe that is super empowering and important. And also I believe it is really, really fun. It's been the cornerstone of what I've spent as much of my time on for the last, I guess, 31 years now at this point. I don't know at what point I started creating things, but at whatever point I possibly could. And I really think it's just always been so much more fulfilling for me to work on things, whether I created them or not, that are sort of being built up from scratch. Never feels like work and always feels like fun, even when it's a grind. So I really do recommend it if you can swing it. So thank you so much and go make some stuff. You can hit me up on Twitter if you want, but you can also email me at tommy@alloy.co if you ever have questions or want to dig in more on career paths, how I think about things, startups, technology, whatever the case may be. I'm happy to talk. And also I would love to answer questions now that you may have. Just put them in the chat because I really do know that this is just a broad framework for thinking about things with a couple of examples. And I'm happy to dig into specifics that people have. And if I have a point of view to lend, I will certainly lend it.
Awesome. Well, it looks like we already have our first question. And one is asking, like, why can't you use the credentials to create or vice versa?
I think you totally can. I think credentials are very powerful. And I think especially if you're having trouble accessing certain resources or spaces, that credentials are a really powerful way to sort of blast through that. And so I think if you sort of see yourself as somebody who is already in a position to go like sort of step up and grab those credentials, I think you should do it. The issue comes in, the issue comes into, the issue comes about with, well, chicken and egg problem, right? If you are pursuing the credential, and because you also asked me about vice versa, right? So let's say you're pursuing getting into like the top tech company directly as opposed to indirectly. I'll talk about directly in a second, but let's say you're pursuing it directly. Then there's a certain set of things that you kind of got to do. There's criteria that they define, and you're going to have to spend all your time chasing those things. You may have to get a top CS degree or something similar. You may have to go get a credential somewhere else that you can basically transfer over here. You're going to have to be good at the exact things that they want you to be good at and not sort of tangential things. There's just, you're going to have to kind of operate in a straight line. Versus if you kind of go the other way, create your own credential, you know, eventually Facebook's going to want to hire you anyway. And you might use that, you know, you might use sort of the reputation you build from going off and making stuff to get in there indirectly later on, which may level up your career even further. You know, if you're, for example, somebody who's a startup founder who could never have gotten a job, like I couldn't get hired at my startup now, right? Like if I applied for a job at Alloy, like I would not even be considered. I think with my sort of background, which is, by the way, something we try to work on to make sure that, you know, we're looking at all types of folks, but I would just be so outclassed by everybody who's applying, right? So if I can't get a job at Alloy, I kind of got to go start Alloy, and then I'm eligible, you know, maybe with my resume now as having, you know, started and run Alloy, I could maybe get a job at the next Alloy, but I couldn't have without that. So you have this chicken and the egg problem. If you're somebody who you think you already have a direct line or a very easy path or a straight path to getting a credential that can help advance your career earlier, I think there's nothing wrong with doing it. Or in fact, there's a ton of value in doing it. I think you should go for it. But most of the people I talk to don't have a straight line to Stanford or Harvard or HBS. So I think typically trying to think about, well, how could you create that for yourself while keeping yourself on a path that is or create the you know, not needing it anymore, I think is what usually people are struggling with more so than deciding whether to go in the first place if you already have the option.
Awesome. So now we have another question from another attendee that is asking if you have any suggestions about coming up with ideas about making stuff. Because they find the hardest part about making stuff is just getting off the ground, thinking up an idea.
I have two suggestions that I think are worth thinking about. The first is, if you really struggle with coming up with ideas, and that's just not that you love working on stuff and you love building stuff, but you don't necessarily, you're not somebody who gets really high conviction around an idea when you're the one who came up with it. Because I find when people say, "Oh, I have trouble coming up with ideas," what they typically don't have trouble coming up with ideas, because everyone can kind of come up with ideas. It's having trouble having conviction in an idea, deciding that this is the idea to work on, or this is a big idea. Sometimes it's true that just having ideas in the first place is not, you know, just not really how your brain kind of operates, and you like to sort of take an idea and run with it. But sometimes it's just that having a lot of more time, it's just having conviction that you should spend a ton of time working on this, recruit other people to work on it, etc. If you're in that situation, then I suggest finding somebody who is both, you know, creative in the way that you need, which is they have high conviction and in they're coming up with ideas or an idea that they have a lot of conviction in, and that can be helpful to you and you can be helpful to them. You know, Matt, none of the things that I believe that Matt has worked on, the example I gave, were his idea, but he gets really excited occasionally about an idea he hears from somebody else, and he has a reputation for being somebody now who you can come to with a very early proto version of an idea. He can help you workshop it into an idea that'd be exciting and also create it and take it into the wild. Ace, who I talked about, who was the gentleman on the left in the picture, is more the idea creator, Ace and Justin. They're entirely equally valid. Because again, this talk isn't about go make stuff that you thought of. It's go make stuff. And I think making stuff with a team or with partners is amazing. My second suggestion is if you do think that you're somebody who can come up with ideas, you're just struggling to do it, or just struggling to know where to focus. Um, don't try not. I guess my suggestion would be not try not to think about like too much about what a good idea and a bad idea is, and follow your interest. I think your interest and the level of intensity of your interest in an idea is by far the best heuristic to consider whether it's actually a good idea or not. Because trying to fit it into some sort of like, just thinking about startups in particular, trying to fit it into like a cookie cutter version of like what a good startup idea is going to make you come up with generic ideas that you're not passionate about and you have no unique insight into. And the same is true of something you might write. Hey, what's a good blog? Well, a good blog is a blog that is interesting, that is written about something you're interested in most of the time, because it's hard to write interesting things about things you're not interested in. So if you do think you're somebody who has good ideas, but you're having trouble deciding what's worth pursuing, follow your interest first, and then get other opinions second, but follow your interest first. And if you're somebody who doesn't find yourself having good, high conviction ideas that you want to pursue, find somebody who does and become partners with them. The easiest way to become partners with somebody is just be a willing listener and collaborator before you decide to dive all in. Everybody's looking for somebody to listen to their idea and to kind of bounce it off with them and be a supporter and a cheerleader. And you can start with that. And then, you end up saying, hey, I think about this all the time now that you brought it up to me. Can we work on it together? Then work on it together.
Awesome. Well, we have another question asking, are there any skills you would suggest working on when taking non-traditional pathways?
Skills that are directly linked to making things. I know that is so obvious, and I'm a broken record, but writing. Actually, if I had to pick one, I would say writing. I think becoming a good written communicator, and I don't mean writing like writing a book. I mean just getting good at putting your words on, digital paper, but putting words down in a way that can communicate to people very well basically translates into every creative medium. Sometimes writing is the medium itself, but a lot of times, like let's say, for example, you need to go start a nonprofit or a movement or an event. You're going to have to write a lot of very convincing things, because you're going to have to write a lot of convincing emails. You're going to have to write probably a lot of convincing blogs and like calls to action and that kind of thing. That kind of thing just scales so well. So I think honing your written communication is maybe the most important thing you can do, because it's going to allow you to get your message out, whatever it is. It's going to allow you to recruit people. It's going to allow you to keep people engaged. So in terms of hard skills, I think that's as good a one as exists, but there's so many others. I mean, anything that sort of touches making things, whether it's, and again, I'm using my sort of software company bias here, but whether it's writing software, whether it's working with existing tools that help you publish things like low and no code type things, whether it's working with sort of more artistic mediums, whether digital or physical, those are things where if you can actually use skills that go into producing things versus management skills or sort of like politicking skills for moving up the chain at a big company, or sort of like useless knowledge wasn't when it comes to making things, but useful knowledge when it comes to being part of a big thing. When you have those direct skills that can help kind of jettison something off the ground, those people will be attracted. People with the ideas that you might want to work with are going to be attracted to that. People who might want to work with you, want to work with people who can actually build things. If I had to pick one, I would say writing. I know a lot of people say like writing code, and that's actually how I started my career. And I don't want to downplay the importance of that in today's economy, but I really think writing is I assume you all are thinking about learning and working on writing code. So I'm taking that as table stakes. I think writing is the one that I would focus on if I had to pick one.
All right, that was really a fascinating answer, and I really appreciate it. It looks like the attendee who asked that question wanted to specify that they're thinking more of like personality traits than like traits that you can like sit down and learn. Do you have any suggestions about that?
Yeah, the only one that I know is getting people excited to work with you and figuring out how that works. That's I don't know how to describe you how to do it, but either figuring out how to get people to be excited to work on your stuff, or how to get people to be motivated to have you work on their stuff is it's harder than it sounds. It's very hard to be collaborative in this exact way, which is for the exact reason that it's sort of antithetical to being competitive. And so you kind of to be put, and this goes back to like the credentials thing, like all those credentials that you'd be chasing, like getting into college, et cetera, those are zero-sum competitive things. So it's like, I got to beat this, have better grades than X number of people to get into Stanford. But when it comes to making things, it's all about how do I get all the people that I, might need to make this thing go excited to work with me on this thing, whatever that is. So I think that is, I think that's the number one thing to work on, and to observe what are the things I do that seem to drive people away and make it so they don't want to work with me anymore, versus what are the things that make people kind of want to lean in and get more involved with me. Group projects are a good way of thinking about this. Like group projects you've ever worked on, what are the characteristics of the people who get assigned to your group project and you're excited versus like, this is going to suck. And it usually has something to do with their skills, but it usually has a lot to do with their sort of mentality and demeanor. So those are the types of soft skills that are hard, but are really worth over focusing on, because you're going to really want people to want to be around you and want to work with you if you're going to be in a sort of making things state of mind.
Awesome. Well, we have another question asking if Harvard Business School is valuable besides just being a credential.
Probably. That's probably as far as I should go there. I think it's a credential and a network. I think you're going to get a credential and a network there, and I don't want to downplay that, but I can't imagine. It's very hard for me to imagine a scenario where I would recommend that somebody go to a business graduate school for a reason other than a credential and a network. By the way, most people who decide to go to those schools make a very smart, informed decision to go get the credential and the network. It's not a bad call, but it is what it is.
Awesome. We have another question wondering is, should you pursue an idea if it's already been done? Is it worth trying to improve the idea?
I mean, why do you have the idea if it's already been done? I think in reality, that means it hasn't already been done. So you might say, okay, I'm going to start a social network. Well, that actually might be a bad idea, but let's say it's not a bad idea. I'm going to start a social network where Facebook already exists. So it's like, why are you saying I want to start a social network? It must be because you think there's something about Facebook that is not quite how it should be, or maybe ideally deeply not how it should be, because you want to be kind of passionate about the thing. You don't want to look at just like an edge improvement. So no, I don't think you want to worry too much about sort of the aesthetic, it's already been done-ness. You want to worry about the true, has it already been done ness. And that's really only when it comes to startups. I think when it comes to other things, like don't worry about copying them at all. There's a lot of good example is writing. There's a lot of times that I know folks will say, man, everything I'm thinking about writing, every blog I'm thinking about writing feels like it's already been written. And okay, A, it hasn't been written by you. So would you take a different take on it? Probably. B, it hasn't been read by the people who would read what you would write. So it has value to recreate something, even if you don't think you have a unique spin on it, although ideally you should have a unique spin on it. And then C, like, just because it's already been written by other people and read by other people doesn't necessarily mean there's not value in going through the process of shaping that on your own. I think a lot of people get really wrapped up, especially in really creative fields like writing or comedy or things like that, like worrying about being too similar to some other thing that already technically exists versus having your own voice and your own spin on things and your own audience for those things. So I don't worry about it too much, but it just depends on what you actually mean by it's been done before and in what field you're in. But I think it's overrated and usually not true.
Awesome. So we have another question asking, would you find more diversity my apologies. Do you find more diversity when looking at these like non-traditional pathway to careers? I'm not really sure which type of diversity the attendee is referring to, but I guess we can just look at it in a general sense.
I
Oh, it looks like diversity of like individuals.
yeah, I assumed. Yes, I think one of the most important. So putting my like Alloy hiring hat on, I think one of the most important part of why I even give this version of this presentation, or just present this theme so much, is because I think that, one, redefining how we as founders and CEOs and things like that, like, think about credentials and what we're kind of looking for and how we define success needs to evolve, and has evolved actually, but not fast enough. It needs to evolve to be able to measure the types of things I'm talking about here. What is it actually like to work with this person? What can they actually do? What can you hand them they can run with and they can just make it happen? And having gone to, I'm really picking on HBS here, I'm sorry, but having gone to HBS doesn't tell you much about whether you can hand somebody a task and have them run it down start to finish, bring other people together to get that done, sort of like do it without making everybody, furious at them, etc. But somebody who's actually done that before in another medium, that does say that about them. And I think to get more like, regardless of where you start, right, depending on what kind of diversity you lack, it is certainly, I believe, very true that you have a better chance of getting a more diverse set of voices at the table if you're able to take a more holistic look at why somebody might be able to kind of be successful at your organization. If you're just saying you have to have gone to a top 10 school to work at my company, then I'm outsourcing the criteria for what success is to those top 10 schools. And I can't be creative about who I actually look for and how I look for people who might bring something different to the table. So I definitely think it's true that you're going to find, a little bit more, a more diverse set of voices by looking at things holistically this way. And I think one of the most important things that CEOs and people who hire people can do is try to redefine how you look at success. Be a little bit more critical in the way that you look at success, and not sort of just take the cookie cutter models. That said, again, I want to re-point out that, like, getting into or working at one of these great credentialed institutions is also very impressive. So you don't want to ignore that. Somebody who can achieve that it's very impressive. We don't ignore that at all, but we shouldn't. But so use that as a tool. But I think if you can take a multivariate look at how to judge whether somebody might be successful, you're going to have better results, but also a more diverse end state.
Awesome. So we have another question asking if you have an idea and that idea requires you to learn a certain technology. I'm assuming this is in the context of some sort of project in CS.
Yeah.
Do you have any techniques for learning quickly or deploying a project quickly?
Yeah. Yes. Lower your standards is the first one. So getting things out is more important than perfection. Now, it depends on the industry. I work in the most sort of highly regulated, like one of the most sensitive areas of the most highly regulated industry. So we have to do things a little different. But I think assuming you're sort of working on something that's more in the earlier stages, get it out in the wild, and sort of lower your standards is one. But that's not totally your question, because you're kind of asking, how do I go from 0 to 1? I have to learn this technology for the first time. My only real advice there is that you're going to be really, really well suited if you figure out how to start with something that works. So basically trying to deconstruct that, like, fastest way is to sort of not deep understanding, but being able to mess with the thing so let's say you're trying to learn like Ruby. The actual best way to learn it would be to get a fully functioning end-to-end Ruby app from somewhere else, maybe open source or something, get it running, and then try to change it, like try to deconstruct it when it's already working. Because it's very hard to sort of like understand how a Ruby app's going to ultimately work end to end when you have to build each part of it. And you're kind of stuck in this, like, you don't even know if the next thing you're working on is really going to work. So you have a lot of trouble envisioning what the end state is going to be. So I think Trying to find something that's already working and then deconstruct it from there is a great way to speed yourself up and like, oh, this is how this really works. And then you can go back from scratch if you need to. And then the second technique is find somebody who already knows the technology and really recruit them to be around to unstick you. I remember when I was learning Objective-C for the first time, you know, my buddy Evan, like he just like my text to him were just 10 a day, just like, what is this? What is this? What is this? But I got unstuck really fast. And then I didn't have to ask him as many things. And getting unstuck or unblocked is the most important thing when you're learning something. Like, just don't get stuck. Do whatever it takes to not get stuck. And you'll keep, even if it's a little inelegant, not getting stuck is what you got to do.
Awesome. So this is the last question that we have as of now. I invite, if any attendees have any more questions, that this would be an awesome time to put them in the Q&A box. But this is, how do you decide when to pursue an idea full time, and when do you give up on it? Are there any benchmarks or markers to determine whether you should be investing more time and effort into an idea?
Can you repeat that?
Yes, so sorry. How do you decide, and when do you decide to pursue an idea full time, and when do you decide to give up on pursuing it? Are there any benchmarks or markers to determine when you should be investing more time and effort into an idea?
Yeah, I'll tread lightly on this one because this is like super sensitive and very personal, this one. Because the best way to make an idea successful is to like be pretty relentless and like never give up, basically. And yet a lot of times you should give up and you don't want to waste your life. So I think that actually, caveat that this part is not advice. I want to just tell you how I think about this, which is I try to always take a little bit of make longer term decisions and then more medium term decisions, and then don't revisit them in the short term. So for example, when deciding when to take the leap, I typically have decided when I just can't let go of something, when I'm like, I think about this all the time. I think about it in the shower. I think about it when I'm walking my dog. This is just like, I'm obsessed with this idea. And I think I have some other people that are similarly obsessed. And I feel like this needs to exist. That's the best reason to start something, is you just feel like pretty passionate about the fact that something needs to exist. What's going to happen from there is you'll try to make it exist, and it'll be like really rocky at first. And so then you'll want to give up like right away or pretty quickly, because it's just not sexy to do the work. And once you start doing the work, it feels like work, sometimes at least. And at certain points, and you're going to fail a lot. And that's just like, that's the worst, a lot of little failures, few big successes is kind of it's like fail, succeed, and fail, succeed. Like that's how you kind of build something. And so you don't want to revisit it too much in the moment. You want to kind of like look back on why you started in the first place and what you said. And when you start, you usually are able to say something like, well, if after a year we haven't been able to do any version of X, Y, or Z, maybe we should revisit it. Well, then try not to revisit it too much until that year is out, unless you're getting really strong signals that this just isn't going to work. At the same time, this is all like very bird's eye view way of thinking, because then the other part of it is like, well, what happens to your life during that? How much is it sort of taking a toll? So just a caveat to that entire way of thinking, which is to try to really try to go heads down for a period of time and revisit only periodically whether you should stop, and try to talk to other people about whether you should stop, not just yourself. If you're starting to feel like you should, because some people might talk you out of it. Some people might talk you into it. The caveat to that is like, don't destroy yourself pursuing anything. Like, don't ever let sort of not giving up, take your sort of personal happiness down to an untenable level. And, there's sort of that like culture of like, never give up, that's what it takes to succeed is totally true. Giving up is the only way to be guaranteed to fail, I guess. At the same time, like, never giving up can be pretty brutal. So I just want to put that caveat out there. But that's how I think about it. I start things when I've always liked it when people start things, because they just feel like it's like almost like a mission that they just can't get out of their heads. and stop things only when sort of longer term goals that they've set out for just seem unachievable, but not in the moment, like over a longer period of time. Revisiting it day in and day out is too brutal, and it doesn't really work. So.
Awesome. So we have another question asking about how you came up with the idea for Alloy. Was it from talking to people? Did you have a background in finance? Was it from just Googling it? How did you come up with, I guess, the problem that Alloy is trying to solve?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of avoid my part of the story because I have had a particularly I've had a lot of it, and you know, I have had some sort of more credential type things in my life, and so I don't want to sort of diminish those. But that said, the way I got into what I do now is I graduated college with a degree that nobody cared about, from a good school, but nobody wants to hire a history major. And that was kind of okay with me because I liked making stuff already. So I had this organic desire to make stuff. And so I got into building software products, which is something I sort of knew how to do, but not really, mostly by working with other people at first. Some of the things I worked on became somewhat successful, and that got me a reputation as a person who can make things. No surprise. That's the topic of the talk. And so I got recruited to basically work at a payments startup doing this particularly esoteric kind of payments, but we innovated a lot of cool technology things there over the course of the year and a half I was there. And we basically learned that our biggest problem was when people were trying to make payments through our system. You can think of us as like a PayPal type thing. When they were trying to make payments through our PayPal type thing, we couldn't figure out if it was, okay, this looks like Tommy trying to make a payment to Evan. Well, but is it really Tommy? Like, how do we figure that out? And we built a bunch of tech to stop, to basically prevent people who were not who they said they were from being able to make payments in other people's names, using other people's bank accounts, et cetera. And we were really surprised to learn that a lot of our partners and clients did not really feel satisfied with the tech they had built around that same concept. And we basically said, well, this should just be a thing. This should just be a product you could buy. And so my co-founders and I basically left and started this thing. But, of the 5 of us who left to start it, all but one of us had never worked in financial services until max 18 months ago, and only at something that was a very small company that we even were like on the ground floor of helping to start. So 3 of those people were under the age of 24 or 25. None of us were over the age of 30. And we were basically proposing to go out and build the system that would basically verify identities for the largest financial institutions in the country, which we do now in many cases. And that was hard. And it would have been easier if we had credentials or a background that was had a little bit more length to it. And again, I had some of that, and my co-founder Laura in particular had some of that. And our CTO worked at Microsoft for a year, and so we had some of that. We could make a case, but mostly we didn't have any of that of note. But the reason it worked out is because we just built something really great. And that's not enough. So we went and told people about it, and we found people who really needed it, got them to use it and love it and sing our praises for us. And then ultimately that became our credential. Our credential became all the companies that we'd helped and all the people that they'd served as a result of that. And now that is my credential. I don't have to talk about what I did before and litigate whether it was impressive. I have I have the results for what I do now, and that's all anybody really cares about. I can tell you it was harder to do it because we couldn't just say, oh yeah, we built this at like Chase, and so Wells Fargo, you should use it. And by the way, Chase is probably going to buy it too, because like we basically built it there. We know they need it. Yeah, that would have been easier. But I don't know how I would have gotten in that position. I don't know how I could have made that happen. But I know how I could make what I did happen, which was getting a reputation for building things, getting the chance to help build some important stuff, and recruit some great people to come start something from scratch that turned out to add a lot of value, which is what people care about. It's one of the things people care about.
Awesome. Well, it looks like, we have one more question. How did you go from a history major to working in software?
Making things. I just started. There's no real better explanation than that. I found some people who could help build some stuff I was thinking about. and were willing to do that with me if I would help with everything else. They taught me how to build software, and then I self-learned from there. But just kept building things. Like I really do think that I really do think like there's not a particularly more complicated story to me than that. I mean, I think I got a lot of chances because of some other sort of aspects of my life, like where I went to college or who I knew or whatever. Like I've had tons of advantages. I'm not like, there's nothing like, I have no like famous people in my background or anything like that. I just mean like I went to a decent school and, knew enough people who could kind of introduce me to folks who might give me an opportunity. So I don't want to imply that I kind of did it from scratch. I find that just so distasteful when people do that. But at the same time, like, for getting into software, I had just nothing, no leg to stand on when I graduated school. I had nothing to show that would point to getting into software, other than that I just started building stuff. And then eventually became enough of that stuff I built became known as being good, or at least on its way to being good, that people took chances on me from there. And I just kept going. But I really don't like have a better story than that. There's no path other than like, I didn't know what I was going to do. And I just was like, I think I'll just start making stuff. And it sort of, people find their way to you when you're a creator to some extent. It's not a guaranteed version of success, but people will find their way to you a lot more than a lot of other versions of career development. So yeah.
Awesome. So we have another attendee asking, how did you go about finding these big clients? How do you enter one of these big organizations as like a small company?
I still ask myself that every day. How are we gonna do it? I think the only answer that I hate to sort of beat a dead horse here, because there is some more nuance to this answer than I'm presenting versus some of the others, but man, a lot of it just has to do with the stuff that we've made. So the easiest way to get into a large institution is basically to build something that maybe somebody smaller needs really badly, getting it in their hands, having it make a big impact, and then going and telling that story. People become aware of it. And then when you approach them or get, be able to find sort of the folks at that institution who might want to talk to you, they have some heuristic for looking up whether you're actually legit or not. It has a lot to do with it. On the flip side, I think the reality is, as you try to get into larger and larger anything, you have to go sort of get those credentials. And I think that's the reality is, we have a lot of people as we've started to become bigger and more successful and really prove that we've got the kind of best version of what we do. The people with the credentials want to come work and help us. And so, we have advisors now and investors and folks on the team who can go and kind of make their way into to finding their way into these larger institutions. But the only reason they want to talk to us is because they have the correct impression that we can solve their problems, which comes from the stuff we've made.
Awesome. So we have another question asking, what were some of the earlier projects you worked on when you were starting to learn about software development?
Yeah, so the two that I worked on, the three that I think I worked on that had the most impact were, the first thing I ever worked on was basically an app to show drink specials in Charlottesville, Virginia, where I went to school, and then eventually the whole state of Virginia, and then was about to be the East Coast. And just a classic college problem, like where's the cheap beer, basically. But as you can also probably imagine, that was very popular. It was a popular thing to use. So became sort of a 30, maybe this is a sad story, I don't know, but 30% of like the UVA student body would use it every week and stuff like that. So yeah, I don't know what that says about those people and about us, I guess, because I was one of them. But that said, super popular thing. And that kind of got the beginning of my sort of I can get stuff made story going. The next thing that I think was notable was I helped with a project that actually the three folks I was talking about earlier from BCU worked on, called Coffitivity. It was an ambient noise player that became this like really popular website and was one of Time Magazine's best websites of 2013 and stuff. And I didn't even have that much to do with it, but I had enough to do with it that I got some credit. And then from there, I got a bunch of work building some apps and the website for the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. which was the last thing that I did before I got recruited into the payments world. So all over the map.
Awesome. Well, it looks like we've gone through all the questions. I want to thank the attendees for asking like 12 questions. That's so many. And I want to thank our speaker for staying so long and answering all of them, as well as giving such an amazing presentation.
Thank y'all so much. Anytime. And ping me if you want to talk. I'm happy to do it.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful afternoon.